welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story: The Haunting of Crescent Street, a story of unseen forces. It was a cold October night when I walked into the store for the first time. The old shop stood on Crescent Street, tucked between two aging apartment buildings, its windows cracked and covered in layers of grime. The sign above the door, Crescent Finds, flickered dimly, as though it had long forgotten its purpose. But to me, it felt like fate. I was only 17, looking for my first job, and this place seemed like the perfect fit. The shop specialized in second-hand items, antiques, clothes, furniture, and odd knickknacks people forgot they had. On the surface, it was a quaint little spot, but I quickly realized there was more to it than met the eye. The manager, a gruff man in his early 40s named Paul, introduced me to my new co-workers. There was Sarah, a quiet but friendly woman in her late 20s who always seemed to be lost in her own thoughts, and Mark, a laid-back guy with a sarcastic sense of humor. We all became fast friends, despite the strange energy that seemed to hang in the air, especially after hours. It was on my second week that I noticed it. The store always felt different after dark. The shelves seemed to groan under the weight of their forgotten contents, and the air would grow cold in certain parts of the store, even on the warmest evenings. The flickering lights above our heads were a constant irritation, but what truly unnerved me were the sounds. Sometimes, late at night, when the store was empty, you could hear soft footsteps echoing through the aisles. You'd think it was just a trick of the mind, maybe the sound of the old wooden floorboards creaking under the weight of the building. But no, this was something else. The footsteps were too deliberate, too rhythmic. Mark would joke about it, saying, maybe it's the ghost of a shoplifter from the and #3980s, still haunting the place. Maybe we'll find him tonight. He'd laugh, but the rest of us just smiled awkwardly. We'd learned to brush off the strange sounds, chalking them up to the buildings' age and the heavy winds of Seattle that made even the most solid of structures feel alive. But one evening, something happened that we couldn't ignore. It was a regular Tuesday night. The clock struck 10 p.m., and we were all preparing to close up. I was stacking a few old books on a shelf in the back when the alarm went off. Beep! 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 I froze, heart racing. The alarm had never gone off during our shift before. We immediately rushed to the front. Paul grabbed the phone and dialed the security company. I glanced nervously at the entrance, but nothing seemed out of place. "We're getting a security breach alert," Paul muttered, his brow furrowed. "Someone's in here." But as we looked around the store, there was no sign of anyone. We checked every aisle, every corner, even the bathrooms. The doors were locked, the windows intact. Still, the alarm continued blaring. Paul didn't waste time. He called the police, and as he spoke to the dispatcher, I felt a strange chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't just the temperature in the room. Something felt wrong. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, but by then, the alarm had stopped. They couldn't find anything either. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows. Just the persistent feeling that something was off. After a few minutes, they left, and we were left to figure out what had happened. The next morning, Paul went straight to the security footage. He asked me to come along to help him review it. We sat in the small security office in the back of the store. The old computer screen flickered to life, showing the footage from the night before. We scrolled through the recordings, expecting to see some sort of glitch or mistake. But what we saw made my blood run cold. At first, everything seemed normal. The cameras showed the store's empty aisles, the occasional shadow moving from the light above. But then, something strange happened. One of the aisles, near the back of the store, started to move on its own. At first, it was subtle. A coat rack near the wall began to sway gently. We both leaned in, trying to make sense of it. Then, the bizarre part began. A hanging sign, one of those old brass signs that read 50% OFF, began to swing violently, back and forth, as if something was tugging on it. But there was nothing there. No draft. No one nearby. Just the sign moving on its own. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Paul's face was pale as he continued to watch. The camera feed continued to play. At this point, the store's main entrance came into view, and that's when the real terror set in. The front door, which had been locked when we checked it earlier, started to rattle violently. The handle shook as though someone, or something, was trying to open it. I could feel my heart racing. I glanced at Paul, who was staring at the screen in disbelief. Then, out of nowhere, the coat rack began to topple over. It slammed against the floor with a loud crash. We both jumped. But the worst part? The footage didn't show anyone. There was no figure standing in the aisle. No person anywhere near the coat rack. It was as if an unseen force had done it. In the days that followed, things only got worse. The strange occurrences became more frequent. On one occasion, I was working late with Sarah when we both heard footsteps behind us, but when we turned around, no one was there. "Did you hear that?" I asked her, my voice trembling. She nodded. "Yeah, but no one's here." That night, I stayed late to finish some work. I was alone in the store, or so I thought. As I walked through the aisles, something caught my eye. The coat rack from the footage, now upright again, was swaying gently, as if beckoning me. I took a hesitant step forward, unsure of what I was about to do. My hand was on the rack, just about to steady it when I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was no one there. After that night, I began to avoid staying late. The store, once a place of comfort, had turned into something sinister. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Mark began to show signs of anxiety, and Sarah stopped speaking about the store altogether. One day, Paul called me into his office. He looked troubled, more so than usual. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low. "The footage from last night, it's gone." "What do you mean gone?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "The entire file. All the cameras, they're wiped clean. Like it never happened." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. The footage from the previous incidents had disappeared as well, leaving us with nothing to prove what had happened. It was as if the store was erasing its own history, one frame at a time. As weeks passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The store was no longer just a place of work, it had become a living nightmare. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, sent me into a state of panic. Then, one evening, it happened again. The alarm went off, and we all rushed to the front to find the store empty, just as before. But this time, I saw something I couldn't explain. In the reflection of the front window, there was a shadowy figure standing just beyond the glass. I froze, staring at it, but when I turned around to check the door, no one was there. That was the last straw. I couldn't stay there any longer. The store, once a charming old place, had become something darker, something I couldn't comprehend. The unease had built to an unbearable level. A few days later, I quit. I left Crescent Finds behind, and with it, the strange happenings that had haunted me. But I'll never forget what happened in that store. Even now, when I close my eyes, I still feel the cold hand on my shoulder, the strange force that moved the coat rack, the flickering lights and shadowy figures. I don't know what was in that store. I don't know if it was the building itself, or something more sinister. But Crescent Street is a place I never planned to return to. Story: The Haunting of Maplewood Nursing Home. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the hallways of Maplewood Nursing Home. I had just graduated nursing school and took on my first job as a caregiver here. For the first 2 years, my shift was always the same, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. Most nights, it was quiet. Sometimes, there would be a few calls for help from the patients, those in the later stages of dementia. But sometimes, the quiet would break with something else. Maplewood was only 20 years old, modern by nursing home standards. A spacious garden surrounded by fruit trees, small ponds, and fountains created a tranquil atmosphere. Despite its age, everything was clean, functional, and calm. The building housed about 100 patients, most of them elderly, with advanced stages of dementia. Many had lived their final years here, and a number passed away in their beds. Yet, something about this place didn't feel right. One of the first patients I cared for was Mr. Donovan, an elderly man with piercing blue eyes. He couldn't speak much, only mumbled a few words. "Who can help me?" he'd ask over and over, in the same raspy voice. He had pneumonia and had been slowly deteriorating. His condition worsened quickly, and within a week, he passed away. It wasn't until a few days later, on my first official night shift, that things began to unravel. The night shift had its usual quiet moments, checking on patients, administering medication, making sure the building was secure. My pager beeped suddenly, pulling me away from my thoughts. A sensor had detected movement in room 13, at the far end of the hall. I thought it was another patient needing help, perhaps for the bathroom. So, I made my way down the hallway, but as I passed Mr. Donovan's room, I heard it. A voice, distinct, unmistakable. "Who can help me?" I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I had just passed his room, but he had passed away 5 days ago. I stood in the hallway, my mind racing. The voice was too real, too clear. I opened the door to Mr. Donovan's room, expecting to find a mistake, some glitch in the system. The room was empty. His bed was neatly made, the window slightly cracked, letting the night air drift in. No one was there. I couldn't explain it. A chill ran down my spine, and my thoughts scattered. I had read stories, heard rumors about paranormal occurrences in nursing homes, but never thought I'd experience it firsthand. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I moved through the building, checking on the other patients. But that voice, it lingered in my ears. As the days passed, the occurrences grew more frequent. There was a persistent feeling that something was out of place, though no one spoke of it. The experienced night shift staff acted as though it was just part of the job. When I brought it up to my colleague, Sarah, she shrugged. You get used to it, she said in a soft voice. The patients here, well, let's just say they don't leave quietly. Sarah had been with Maplewood for nearly 5 years. She told me stories of other nurses who had encountered strange things. Doors that would open on their own. Bed sensors that went off after patients had passed. Sometimes, the temperature in certain rooms would plummet, no matter how warm the rest of the building was. One night, after Sarah had left, I stayed alone in the ward, finishing up some paperwork. The lights overhead flickered and hummed, but that wasn't unusual. The sound of movement echoed down the hallway, and I assumed it was just the old building settling. But then, the door to room 6 opened by itself. It was as though someone on the other side had turned the handle and pushed. I wasn't sure if I was hallucinating or if the door had truly moved on its own, but the sensation of being watched was intense. I forced myself to walk over, expecting to find a patient trying to get out of bed, but the room was empty. I checked the sensor. It had gone off. But no one was there. After a few weeks of these strange occurrences, my colleague Mark shared something that chilled me to the bone. Room 3, he said, his voice low. That room's been trouble for a long time. They say it's haunted by something darker. Room 3 was a small, unremarkable room, but it had a history. Before Maplewood was built, the property had been home to another, much older institution, one that housed terminally ill patients. Many had died in room 3 over the years. There were whispers among the staff that the room had been abandoned for a reason, that something malevolent lingered there. Something that fed off the suffering of those who had passed. As I took my rounds one night, I passed by room 3. A strange chill washed over me, stronger than anything I had felt before. As I walked past the door, I glanced inside. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the window, its silhouette dark and motionless. But when I looked again, it was gone. I paused, uneasy. Mark had warned me about this feeling, the one that made you think you were being watched, even when there was no one there. A few nights later, something else happened that I couldn't explain. Maplewood had 2 cats, Milo and Jasper. They roamed freely through the hallways, playing with the patients and offering comfort. Both cats were affectionate, but there was something strange about their behavior, particularly when patients were nearing death. That night, as I passed by room 7, I saw Milo sitting quietly by the door. He wasn't meowing or moving, just staring at the door, his eyes fixed and unblinking. I thought it was odd, but not uncommon. Milo often liked to sit with the patients. But when I glanced into the room, I saw the patient lying in bed, still and pale. The doctor had told us earlier in the evening that she was nearing her final moments. I stepped inside, checking for signs of life. Nothing. I turned to leave, and that's when Milo did something strange. He looked up at me, then stood and walked into the room. He didn't make a sound. He simply padded over to the bed and jumped up, curling up next to the patient's still form. The patient passed away that night. Weeks passed, and the strange occurrences continued. But none were more unsettling than my experience in room 3. The night had been uneventful until I was called to check on a patient who had been in and out of consciousness for days. Her breathing was shallow, and I suspected she didn't have long. As I entered her room, the temperature dropped drastically. My breath fogged in front of me. As I checked her vitals, that's when I heard it, a sound like scratching, coming from the walls. I looked up, startled. but saw nothing. Then, the sensor by her bed went off, its beeping high-pitched and urgent. I quickly turned to silence it, but the sound continued. I turned back to the patient, and I froze. There, in the far corner of the room, was a shadow. A figure, humanoid, but dark, like a stain against the light. It was still, but I could feel its presence, as though it was watching me. I backed out of the room slowly, my heart pounding. As soon as I left, the temperature returned to normal. But I knew something had followed me out. I wasn't alone in the hallway. I couldn't ignore it any longer. It was becoming clear that Maplewood wasn't just haunted by the memories of those who had passed, it was haunted by their spirits. I spoke to Sarah again, seeking answers. She told me she'd experienced similar things, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Spirits are here to stay. Especially in places like this, she explained. But you can't let them control you. You have to talk to them. Let them know you're not scared. Sarah shared a tip with me that I never forgot. If you ever feel like you're being watched, speak out loud. Tell them not to bother you. You'll be surprised how much it helps. I tried it the next time I felt the presence of something unseen. As I passed room 3, I whispered, "You're not welcome here. Please leave me alone." And to my surprise, the oppressive feeling lifted. It was subtle, but the change was real. By the time I left Maplewood, my understanding of the paranormal had deepened. I had learned to live with the presence of spirits, acknowledging that they were simply passing through. Death was a part of life, and in nursing homes, where people spent their final days, it seemed the spirits lingered longer. I didn't feel fear anymore, just a quiet understanding. The spirits, like us, had stories to tell. They were not malevolent, only lost and seeking peace. And perhaps, that was all I could give them in return. It had been months since my last shift at Maplewood Nursing Home. I had left the job, moving to a new city to start fresh, but the memories of what I had experienced there were still vivid in my mind. Despite Sarah's advice to not let the spirits control me, I found it hard to shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. The unsettling events at Maplewood haunted me, particularly room 3. I had returned to the town for a short visit, and curiosity got the best of me. I decided to visit the old nursing home. The once peaceful garden, with its trees and water features, now seemed different. It was a crisp autumn evening, and the fading sunlight cast long shadows across the pathway leading up to the entrance. The building, though still modern, had an air of neglect about it, like it was silently mourning the passage of time. I stood in front of the door for a moment, wondering if I was making a mistake. But my feet moved on their own, as if the place was calling me back. I walked through the familiar halls, passing the nurse's station and the rooms where I used to check on patients. The air felt colder than usual, as though the building itself remembered me. The smell of antiseptic and lavender, which had once been so comforting, now seemed oddly oppressive. I made my way down the corridor to room 3. The door was slightly ajar, as though inviting me in. My heart raced. I had not been in that room since the night I'd felt the shadowy presence, a presence I still couldn't explain. But something told me I needed to understand more. Maybe it wasn't just a random haunting. Maybe there was a reason why room 3 felt so wrong. I pushed the door open. The room was dark, but not entirely. The moonlight from the window illuminated the edges of the room, casting eerie patterns on the floor. The bed was empty, of course. No patient in sight. But the oppressive feeling from that night, of being watched, was back. I stood still, taking in the room. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and the furniture had a dated, almost forgotten quality to it. Yet, nothing seemed out of place, except for a small table in the far corner, covered by a dusty cloth. Compelled by a force I couldn't explain, I walked over to the table. As I pulled the cloth away, my breath caught in my throat. It was an old photograph album, yellowed with age, the pages brittle to the touch. On the cover was a faint inscription, "Memories of Maplewood." I sat down on the bed and flipped it open. The album was filled with photos of patients who had lived at Maplewood long before I ever set foot there. Faces of elderly men and women, their eyes filled with stories, some happy, others troubled. But one image stopped me cold. It was a group photo taken in the late 1950s, in front of the very building I had worked in. The people were smiling, posed in front of what seemed to be the original structure of the nursing home. But there, standing in the back, was a figure that immediately caught my attention. It was a man. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but what struck me most was his eyes. They were hollow, dark, almost lifeless. He seemed out of place, like he didn't belong with the others. I couldn't look away. His presence in the photo was overwhelming. And it felt as though he was staring directly at me, even across the years. Flipping the page, I found another picture, this one darker, taken in what appeared to be a more private, intimate setting. It was a photo of the staff, gathered together in the break room. There were nurses, doctors, and aides, all smiling, posing for the camera. But there, in the back of the group, was the same man. I scrolled through more pages, finding more unsettling pictures, each with the same shadowy figure lurking in the background. The same lifeless eyes. Something was wrong. I closed the album, feeling a chill creep over me. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a story that had been buried, forgotten. I needed to know more. I searched through the rest of the room, my hands shaking as I combed through drawers and cabinets, looking for anything else that might explain what I was seeing. And then, in a far corner, I found a journal. Its leather cover was cracked, and it looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside were handwritten notes in elegant script, dated back to the 1960s. The journal belonged to a nurse named Clara. The first few pages described typical duties, patients, medications, and routines. But as I turned the pages, Clara's writing became more erratic. October 1963. The shadows in room 3 grow stronger every night. I see him more clearly now, the man who haunts these halls. His eyes, they follow me. I don't know what he wants. But I feel him. Lurking, waiting. I'm not the only one who feels it. We all do. And yet, no one talks about it. It's as though we've all agreed to pretend he's not there. November 1963. I saw him again today. He was standing by the window in room 3, just like the others said. The patients didn't seem to notice him, but I saw him. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. He was there. And now I know why they're all so afraid. It's him. He's taking them. One by one. Every time someone dies in this room, it gets stronger. The presence, the power, it grows. December 1963. I tried to leave tonight. I can't. I can't leave. The man won't let me. He's everywhere. The others, my colleagues, they think I'm losing my mind. But I know the truth. He's real. He's not just in our minds. He's not a ghost. He's something worse. And he's going to take me. Next. I felt a coldness seep into my bones as I read those words. Clara had been trying to escape the man, but she never did. Her last entry was a simple line written with trembling ink. I see him now, standing beside me. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. Everything started to make sense. The figure in the photographs, the unsettling presence I'd felt in room 3. It was him. The man who had never left. He wasn't a ghost, a spirit lost between worlds, he was something older. A dark entity. Something that thrived on fear, suffering, and death. He had been here for decades, waiting for the next soul to cross his path. But who was he? Why hadn't anyone told us about him? As I sat there in the quiet room, the temperature began to drop again. The chill returned, this time biting into my skin. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, pulling toward me. And then, I heard it. A faint whisper. A voice, low and rasping, drifting through the still air. Who can help me? I froze. The voice, it sounded familiar. It was the same voice I had heard on my first night. Shift. Mr. Donovan. The man who had passed away weeks before I left. I spun around, heart pounding. And that's when I saw him. The figure from the photograph. He was standing in the doorway, his hollow eyes fixed on me. His face was shadowed, but his presence was unmistakable. His gaze pierced through me. As if he could see every fear I'd ever had. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped in room 3, alone with this thing. But then, I remembered Sarah's words. Speak to them. Let them know you're not afraid. I took a deep breath. Leave me alone, I said, my voice shaking but firm. You don't belong here. You never did. The figure didn't move, but the air in the room seemed to shift. The oppressive weight lightened, just a little. I'm not scared of you, I said again, louder this time. You can't hurt me. You're just a memory. And memories fade. The room went still. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure remained, but the pressure, the darkness, it started to lift. Slowly, the shadow began to dissipate, as if it were being absorbed back into the walls. And with it, the chill faded. The whispers stopped. For the first time since I had entered Maplewood that night, the room felt calm. Quiet. I left Maplewood that night, feeling a strange sense of peace. The cycle had been broken. The man who haunted room 3, he had been stopped, released. But I couldn't forget the lesson I'd learned. Spirits, ghosts, entities, they weren't always what we imagined them to be. Sometimes, they were simply echoes of the past, trapped in places where suffering and death lingered. And sometimes, all they needed was someone to remind them they didn't belong there anymore. As I walked away, I glanced back at the nursing home. The moonlight bathed the building in an eerie glow, but for the first time, it didn't seem so menacing. Maybe, just maybe, the spirits had found their peace at last. Story: the echoes in the walls. I had always been skeptical about the supernatural, dismissing ghost stories as mere tricks of the mind. I worked as a night shift caretaker at an institution for individuals with severe mental disabilities. The building was large, old, and creaky, a place where strange sounds were almost a given. But after the night I experienced, I'm 110% sure something else was going on. I don't believe in ghosts, not anymore. The institution I worked at housed 30 patients, all with varying degrees of cognitive impairment. Most of them were nonverbal, with only a few able to communicate in basic ways. The night shifts were always quiet, with the occasional sounds of the residents shifting in their rooms, the soft shuffle of shoes against the hallway floor, and the distant murmur of the night shift team talking to one another. But lately, something felt different. I was assigned to the West Wing, a section of the building that seemed to be more isolated from the rest. It was older than the rest of the facility, with walls that seemed to whisper in the silence. The rooms were smaller, the doors creaked louder, and the air felt colder. But that wasn't what bothered me, it was the strange noises. I didn't think much of them at first, just dismissed them as the building settling, maybe even the wind. But it wasn't long before I began to notice patterns. It started innocently enough. My first night as the awake caregiver, the one who stays alert while the other team member rests. Everything seemed normal at first, just the usual sounds. The shuffle of slippers, the low murmur of televisions in the rooms. But then, around 11:30 p.m., I heard it, whip whip whip. A series of sharp, rhythmic slaps, like someone was taking a belt and snapping it against something. The sound was odd, coming from somewhere near room 6, and it echoed through the hallway. At first, I chalked it up to the house settling. Buildings make weird noises, right? But the slapping sound continued for several minutes, 4 or 5 whips before it stopped. I tried to ignore it. I went about my duties, checking on the patients, distributing medication, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Around 1 a.m., my colleague, who had been working here for years, mentioned that he'd never heard that sound before. Sounds like someone's hitting something, he said, his face slightly pale. He didn't seem too worried about it, but I could feel a knot tightening in my stomach. The sound stopped just as suddenly as they began. For a brief moment, everything was silent. It felt like a heavy silence, one that wrapped itself around me, pressing down. The second night was when things really began to feel off. The same belt sound returned at 11:30 p.m., but this time it was followed by something more unsettling. As I was walking past the West Wing, a loud bang erupted from the entrance. It sounded exactly like someone running full speed into the glass door. My heart skipped a beat. The noise echoed through the empty halls, sharp and sudden. I paused for a moment, trying to process it. I knew the sound, it was the same as when I had drunkenly stumbled into one of the doors on a late-night walk home from the pub. But this time, there was no explanation for it. I walked toward the entrance, my nerves on edge. The door was firmly closed. No one was in sight. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that it was probably just the wind or a freak accident. But as I turned to leave, I heard something else. A sound that made my blood run cold. Tug tug tug. Someone was yanking at the staff toilet door with such force it was as if they were trying to break it down. I rushed to the door. It was open. The same door I had definitely closed 10 minutes before. My stomach dropped. There was no way my colleague had opened it, his room was right next to mine, and I would have heard the door open or close. No one else was awake. It didn't make sense. I rushed through the building, checking each and every door. Every door that was supposed to be locked was locked. Every door that was supposed to be closed was shut. Everything seemed normal, except the staff toilet door. I quickly returned to the staff room and sat down, my heart still racing. I didn't know what was happening, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. It was during my third night shift when things escalated. The sound returned, whip, 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 but this time, it was accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent chills up my spine. It was like someone was standing just behind me, murmuring something in a language I couldn't understand. My colleague was asleep in the break room, so I was alone in the halls. I quickly glanced around but saw no one. The whispers continued, rising and falling like a distant conversation. Then came the scraping sound, a dragging noise, like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. It stopped suddenly as I rounded the corner to room 5. My nerves were on edge. I couldn't ignore the growing sense that something wasn't right. As I walked down the hall, I noticed that the air was growing colder. Not just a little chill, but a sharp, unnatural cold that wrapped around me like a sheet of ice. I shivered and quickened my pace. When I reached room 3, the door was open. I had specifically closed it earlier, but now it was wide open, the light inside flickering. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called, but there was no response. I stepped into the room, scanning the area. There was nothing. Yet, the whispering persisted. As if it was coming from the walls themselves. I could hear faint cries, muffled sobs, like the sound of someone who was in pain. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, I saw something. A shadow, long and thin, darted across the far side of the room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I was alone, and yet I wasn't. I stumbled backward and fled the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe. The whispers and shadows, the tugging at the door, there was no denying it anymore. This place was haunted. That night, I had reached my breaking point. It was around 2 a.m. when everything seemed to collapse into chaos. The belt sounds were louder than ever, echoing through the halls. The air was colder, the whispers louder. As I walked through the west wing, I heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the floor, followed by a loud crash. I ran to the source of the noise and found a chair overturned in the hallway, though no one had been near it. I backed away slowly, but as I did, the temperature dropped further, and I saw something move at the end of the hall, a dark figure, tall and looming. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was run. I didn't come back after that. I couldn't. I went to my supervisor and requested a transfer, but I was told that there were no more positions available. They hadn't noticed anything unusual. They assured me. But I knew what I had felt, what I had experienced. There are still nights when I hear that belt sound in my mind, and the echoes of those whispers haunt me in my dreams. I don't know what it was, what they were. But I know this much: some places are not just haunted by ghosts. Some places are haunted by something far worse, the echoes of suffering, trapped in the walls. And I'll never forget the night I came face to face with it. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.